Okay, I think it looks like we're drawing dinner to a close, but the bar remains open, so feel free to wander around, keep Chris busy in the corner back there. You know, it's always a lot harder to get people's attention after dinner and after the bar has opened than before, but if I... something like that. So if I could have your attention, thank you so much. So we're drawing dinner to a close, but the bar remains open. And I want to draw your attention to something. We have a few books here, 3 in particular, and we're going to give them away. There's one by Paul Cuppets, entitled God, A Brief History. And another one by our president, Barbara Holmes, Joy Unspeakable. And the third one by our speaker tonight, whom I'm about to introduce to you, Philip Clayton. And this book is entitled Transforming Christian Theology for Church and Society. I recommend all 3 of them, and what we're going to do is we're going to give those away to those of you who tweet or retweet tonight's event the most. Okay, so get on that network, 514, Kitchen, 2G, and Maria gave you the password earlier. It's NOV514, so the first 3 letters of the month of November, and then 514 spelled out. So please tweet tonight's event, and of course do everything else we're going to do, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, and we're going to give these away to you. I would like to introduce our speaker to you tonight and tell you that in terms of format, we're doing things a little bit differently. We don't just want to do the talking head thing. That wouldn't be Philip's way of doing it, and that's not what we would like either. Because I told you that we want to co-create and be dialogical and all the rest of it. But in a minute, Philip Clayton is going to come up and do his, give us a talk on theological education, and it will be briefer than what we're normally used to, but the second half of this talk will be an interview. We have a podcast set up here, so it'll be a live podcast, and then after that there will be a few more conversations at the front. So I would like to introduce Philip Clayton to you. Philip is the Ingram Professor of Theology at the Claremont School of Theology in Southern California. And I could tell you a lot of things about him, his accomplishments, his books, his interdisciplinarity, his positions that he has held, and so on. I will not do that. I'll simply point you to philipclayton.net, and it's all there. Instead, I'm just going to tell you a little story. A few years ago at AAR SPL, that's a major professional conference for us, the major conference. I remember being in San Francisco in a hotel room one evening, and I wondered about Philip. We hadn't met, but I read this book at the time, and I thought, this is intriguing. I want to get to know this person. And someone was able to give me his, I forgot now, your phone number or something, and I texted Philip. And it turns out he was in the same hotel just a few floors above me. So we met spontaneously. That's the kind of person you are. We met spontaneously, and we discovered some common journey elements. I'm from Germany, you probably picked that up by now. And Philip actually spent significant time, I mean, part of your growing up happened in Germany, and you spent time at the University of Munich, or München for the two of us. One of the fascinating things was that Philip immediately invited me, said there's going to be a podcast in somebody's home. Trip Fuller, who's standing over there in the corner, did the podcast somewhere in San Francisco, and Philip invited me to come along, and it was a journey, a whirlwind journey in San Francisco, trying to find the right train and running in the wrong direction, and then a few blocks in the other direction. And finally we got there, and it was a wonderful experience. It was the first time I met Phil. It was also the first time I met Trip right behind him, and you'll hear more from Trip. But what was intriguing about that podcast was I realized that Philip is all about reimagining theological education, and I realized that he's eminently placed to be at the forefront of that, and that is exactly where he is. He's a wonderful scholar, very integrative, very interdisciplinary, and one of the best people around for imagining or reimagining theological education. And consequently, Philip, who is part of an organization called Convergence US, and I don't know if you want to say more about them or not, that's entirely up to you, but that organization with Philip at the heart of it has won a grant to the tune of $400,000 by the Carpenter Foundation. This is over 5 years, and they've actually chosen Twinstop as one of the partners they're going to feature at their conference. So we're particularly pleased about that. Anyway, enough of me, over to Philip, the perfect person in many ways to talk to us about reimagining theological education. Thank you, Philip, for doing this workshop.
I kind of judge the room a little bit. You know, they always warn you to speak to a place where there's been an open bar. So I'm seeing if anyone's holding the table, to stay out. They say that, the good side of that is you laugh more at the jokes, and the bad side is you don't remember the talk. So I'll try to keep that in mind. And also, after dinner, talks have to be shorter. It's funny, we're breaking out. Yeah, but it was also Spencer was breaking in and out as well. I'll do this without a mic, unless you need me for recording. Right, so we'll decide. If it keeps breaking up, you guys just tell me and I'll take off the headset. Actually, I'd rather do that anyway, but let me know. Am I here? All right, you guys. Well, what I want to do is in a very short period of... Let's take it off. What if I just did this in my regular voice? Could you handle that? Use the mic. Thank you. I love an audience that knows what it wants. Ladies and gentlemen, I have only a couple of minutes, and so I'll waste no time and get right to the point. Radical times call for radical responses. If you think you get it about how great the change is that's upon us, you don't. Actually, none of us know. Because human beings have a tendency to think through things out of their experience from the past. And the more years you add to their lives, the more gray hair appears around the temples, the more likely they are to assume the future will be like the past. That was David Hume's famous problem of induction. The philosopher Thomas Kuhn called it paradigm shift. It's a time when none of the assumptions that made for good arguments in the past hold for the future. We just don't know any longer. Some people are talking about this as a civilization change. Civilization change. So I figured, what's the biggest civilization change in the United States? It has to be the end of the colonial period in the South. Do you remember? Hear the music? The time in the Old South, how in this pretty world gallantry took its last vow. Here was the last ever vision of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. You remember, right? I wanted to show the pictures of Bette Butler and Scarlett kissing, but I couldn't work it into the theological narrative of the meeting. Give me time and I'll get it there in the Q&A time. Now, that was a civilization that had to pass. It was a civilization based on racism, on injustice, and on gaining for the small number. Kind of makes you wonder if we are in that kind of moment ourselves. A conference is bringing together about 800 speakers in Claremont next month, June 4th, to talk about civilization change, the title Toward an Ecological Civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in a time when the new normal is to talk about the death of civilizations. That is no minor shift. Often the phrase is used postmodern. That phrase should make you skid to a stop in your tracks because of 2 or 3 things that it implies. It implies that we can summarize the period of time from the expansion of Europe, 1500, 1600, Luther, Descartes, people started in different ways, until roughly the present. And we can call that modern. By proclaiming it modern, we place ourselves in a place beyond that. The word is actually a negative, as if it started with the word a, the privative. Something beyond the modern. And thirdly, it's a word that says we don't know what. Postmodern says, in effect, we haven't a clue, but the next step forward is what follows that. Sometimes you just have to live in the space of not knowing. The space between the atoms. The space between the epochs. You have to inhabit it. You have to sit with it, as people like to say. As today we celebrate Twin School of Theology, we celebrate moving into a place without knowing what that emerging context will quite be. This takes courage. It takes certain character traits that you don't need when you're at the apex of a civilization and everything is going well and everybody knows what is true, false, right, wrong, past, and future. We don't live in that kind of era. It takes a new kind of leadership and a new kind of leadership training, and therefore a new kind of theological education. But why a warehouse? Marshall McLuhan speaks of the medium is the message. So I decided to ask you to look around at a warehouse and to pause for a moment to think what constitutes a warehouse. And out of that, I want to imagine what a warehouse theology or a warehouse ecclesiology might be. And out of that, to imagine a new form of theological education. Friends, when I was teaching in Northern California in a philosophy department some years ago, I had a colleague, Roger Bell, who, as a postmodern, post-structuralist, said, I'm not going to write a book, I'm going to build a house. To express my understanding of Jacques Derrida, I'm going to build a house. So he deconstructed a house. No. He actually built a house in a warehouse district north of San Francisco. And the house was built, this is the 3rd floor, looking like a warehouse and looking out onto the warehouses beyond him. You can see that he consciously played with industrial themes in constructing this house. By the way, it later became this award-winning house and now is featured in architecture magazines all over the country. The idea was to imagine an exterior, which was warehouse, and then to wonder about the living space within a warehouse. Could you humanize a warehouse? Could you find in it home? And so he played off the fact that looking the other direction was an American residential neighborhood with redwood trees, calm, bucolic. And his point of this book, which was a house, or house which was a book, was that's where we live. In between a space of an industrial complex and the living space that we as human beings need, as Thorsten spoke a moment ago, to live and move and have our being. That's what home means, though it's Acts 29. Roger succeeded. It's a beautiful living space. We have incredible parties, and he and his extended family lived in this space outside a warehouse. I emphasize industrial complex because we face an age, or is it a demise, of an ecclesial industrial complex. A time when church rode the waves of success, rose with the tide in the most dominant and powerful superpower ever in the history of the world. And it too learned how to be part of a successful industry, not always aware of how traditional language of a homeless rabbi was being co-opted for the purposes of industry, of politics, of national security interests, and the like. Not always aware how the veneer of spirituality was linked to causes diverse and sundry of this country in particular. Not always aware of the cost of that co-option for the type of language that was being offered. We Christians became a sort of Disneyland where one could find princes. Maybe Jesus was the greatest prince of all, and princesses who could bring the fantasy life to the neighborhoods outside of it. Maybe struggling against that co-option is the first step. Maybe we need to learn as theological educators how to just say no. For when churches join the ruling regime of knowledge, they're furthest from their mission. And religion is more powerful, not less, in times when epistemic certainties collapse around us, piles of rubble, broken bricks. For prophetic religion always questions ruling norms and values. This prophetic message won't be new to you, but the question is, which side should theological education be on? How is its prophetic side manifested? Where does it say no to ruling educational norms? Where does it buck the tide? Again, that question of postmodern goes deeper and deeper and deeper than any of us can conceive. Warehouse theology. What is it? Why is it so important? Well, what then are warehouses? I mean, they're not ostentatious. They're not built in wealthy and high status neighborhood. They're focused on the functional. They're like an old pickup truck. You know, you just get in one, you want to go haul something. You want to go do something, right? Attach a trailer. Let's throw some tools in there. We can get something done now. This thing is made to get stuff done. In warehouses, merchandise are stored in order to be gotten out to people who want it. Good stuff is stored, stuff is not consumed. It's a symbol so that it can be shared and used. Warehouses are easily repurposed. And therein, my friends, lies the core of warehouse ecclesiology, repurposing. Think with me about some of these repurposing. Here's a theater in Brooklyn, St. Ann's Warehouse, actually getting some of the best reviews in Brooklyn for new theater. Here's a restaurant and auction center built out of a warehouse in the Midwest. You can even store Buddhist sculpture. So we're not just spiritual about it. In the Lotus Sculpture Warehouse. This could only be in California. A community gathering place is absolutely my favorite. Look at how cool and inviting that particular warehouse becomes. A wedding. You can repurpose a warehouse for a wedding. And in case you're interested in buying, you can live in warehouses. Now, I think given the warehouse before this was probably worth virtually nothing, and what they sold those yuppie townhouses for, I don't want to think about it. Okay? We look at how inviting, look at this space, right? How inviting you can make that space of the warehouse, right? And of course, if you live in a warehouse, you get to bring the bikes inside and you kick the soccer ball against the walls. So my 12-year-old twins are convinced we need to move to a warehouse as soon as possible. And then, of course, you can do theology in a warehouse. Warehouses are where the real work gets done. It's one of the most efficient structures we know. It's not flashy. So a warehouse ecclesiology is a church on the streets. It's a church where the people are. It's a church that works with the products that people care about. And it can be quickly repurposed when those projects and interests move in a different direction. So warehouse ecclesiology has to be holistic. It's not, and warehouse education has to be holistic. It can't be a theology that dissects, that tears apart into little pieces any longer with analytic purity. You remember what Mark Twain said, explaining humor is a lot like dissecting a frog. You learn a lot in the process, but in the end, you kill it. Theological education has been a lot like dissecting a frog. You learn a lot in the process. And in the end, too often, you kill faith. In the last 10, 12 years of seminaries teaching, I've seen these excited young MDiv students walk in with a sense of calling and a willingness to turn the world upside down, and the first thing we give them is Dennis McDonald's New Testament class, right? And no, it wasn't inspired. It's actually a cheap imitation of Greek tragedy. It's a weak-kneed attempt to do Homer over again, and nothing you believe about this scripture is right. It's all a mistake, and then they get, a theology class that tells them that all the theology they learned is wrong, and ethics class, and by the time that we send them out, they've got what we used to call liberal laryngitis, right? Not a word is left to be said, and they go out with crutches and bandages on after theological education. And then we say, here, take a pulpit and inspire some folks. Is there something with this model that's broken? How deeply do we have to change? I fear it's changed all the way down. So, if you want to do warehouse ecclesiology, you've got to look at three fundamental changes. A God beyond all predictability and system. A God that can't be dissected or domesticated. And upside down ethics. An ethics of one who would ignore the rich and powerful and find the lowest of the low to whom to make the revelation to. A woman, a Jew, pregnant, out of wedlock. And her first Magnificat, the first Christology that we read in Luke, is about God reaching down to the lowest and exalting them. That's a warehouse ecclesiology. No white steepled churches. It reminds me, to use a secular metaphor, that this warehouse might include Nietzsche's transvaluation of values. This is God's transvaluation of values. And finally, an inside-out church. A church where we sort of hope that a helicopter comes by, pulls off the roof, lets the walls fall outward, and the people sitting in the pews suddenly have to look outside the door. Now, no walls. Kind of wave hi to the folks on the sidewalk, and maybe they wave hi back, and after a while, sitting in a destroyed church, you figure, well, might as well stand up and go out, let's go have coffee. Warehouse means getting out of the safe context in which we've lived for so long. But you guys, this actually pushes the greatest weakness, neurosis, psychosis of Christianity, because in warehouse ecclesiology, correct beliefs are no longer the indispensable ticket for admission. We have been hung up in the Christian church with something called orthodoxy. We figured that what folks came up with 300 years after a homeless rabbi told some amazing parables, what could be creedified and credoized and placed on a document in attractive Latin and Greek, that was the essence of this man's message. And we held that as the bar so that only those who understood could enter. And theological education was about mastering that set of creeds so that they could be passed on to the next generation. I remember being a 12-year-old. The only thing I remember was try to remember those 6 attributes of God, or they won't give you the grape juice and bread afterwards. Right? See, God is a spirit, infinite and eternal in his being and perfections. And there were at least 6, and if you only have 5, there was no grapefruit for you, grape juice for you. We have to rethink belief from the bottom up. My colleague Roland Faber says, let's stop thinking about belief systems. Let's talk about rhizomes. Rhizomes are the plants that you see on the wall in front of you. Rhizomes are messy and interlocked and interdependent, and you are not going to get propositions that ramrod their way down to some sort of bedrock beneath it all with a rhizome. But you are going to get holism, organic, interrelated, personal living. Rhizomatic theology grows organically and jumbled together, and it's beautiful and incomprehensible and life-changing. The kind of thing that belongs in warehouse. It's actually beautiful. These are rhizomes. Actually, a metaphor is in a certain kind of aspen grove known in Latin as Pando populus. In these groves, every one of these trees comes from a single root ball, a single rhizomatic system of roots. In fact, they're defined not as 200 trees, but as one organism. And estimates are this is the oldest organism on the planet, because continuously this one system has given rise to these trees who have grown and fallen, but that underlying root continues to grow. We've used that as the model for our June conference and tried to imagine what kind of relation between humans would be based if we saw that at root we are all one. It gives rise to some pretty radical understandings of our being with each other. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what warehouse theology would be like. I need to close. I want to close by reminding you of some mistaken models and ending with a positive model. In classical theology, we built up altars to the God we knew, sacralizing the lifestyles that we enjoyed. In classical theology, we climbed the mountain with Jesus, and like Peter, we wanted to build tabernacles so that we could stay up with him and other theological educators away from the world. We took the butterfly of the spiritual life out of its natural ecosystem, the church, society. We pinned it to the wall for seminarians to study and to take with them to revivify in pulpits for the rest of their life. We came to view the theological efforts of the past as a buried treasure unearthed by the academics and those who know ancient languages. We put the gold coins into our seminary museums and coffers and charged admission prices called tuition to learn about them. That's my Old Testament professor on the right. We took the sacred scrolls of the past and locked them up in monasteries. Those who wished to learn were then invited to sojourn with us, leaving their former lives and often partners and families behind for 3 years, so that the monks, the church historians, and biblical scholars, and the theologians could share the riches of their wisdom with them on their way to future religious leadership. And then when we packed all the knowledge into them, we sent them out into the world. Don't get me wrong, the theological disciplines are valuable, but something in that model is broken. It's not going to work any longer. We need to imagine theological education anew, which is why we're here in this room. Theologies and creeds from the past are challenges for reflection, not weapons with which to beat down your opponents. Theology is something, whatever it is, that's ever evolving and ever in process. Theological reflection is about action in the world. These are the premises of a warehouse theology. You see, there are cycles in spirituality which the historians are well aware of. A time of spiritual movement like the Great Awakening. Then institutions are formed, the Methodist Church, Assemblies of God after Azusa Street, Young Life after the Jesus People, a variety of national organizations after Dr. Martin Luther King calls together a national movement for equality in our country. And then, friends, at some point, the institutions no longer work for a new generation, and it abandons them. That leads to a period of wandering, a spiritual vacuum. And then, inevitably, a new spiritual movement begins, and the cycle is repeated. So please tell me, why do we think that theological education should be immune from this cycle? If spirituality goes through the 5 steps over and over and over again, like a wheel turning as it moves down the road, why would theological education continue to teach the Schleiermacher model from 1809 in the German capital of Berlin? Why would we think that the silos of our tradition are what the future religious leader needs for him or her to be effective? That's radical warehouse thinking. I want to congratulate Union Seminary. United. Nobody else. Let's cut that bit off the video. Congratulate United PTS for having had the vision to launch this new start in theological education, and to recognize that sometimes we need not just to adapt what exists, but to see what it looks like if we plant it afresh, as President Holmes said at the beginning, and watch it grow. We don't know how this particular one will grow and where it will be. It's evolving organically as it goes, and that's the only way to do it. I wish for everyone involved with the Twin Summit program that you be imitated wildly and radically all over the country, because the highest compliment is imitation. You're part of the experiments, heading down the road and not knowing what's around the next corner. And that's exactly where our society, we, and our church are today. So, in closing, let's bring the magic back into theology. Not the magic of a pre-modern worldview, but the magic of the unexpected, of discovery, of serendipity, of relevance. Let's learn again, as theologians, to do what William Blake so famously said, to see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. Thanks.
There are people streaming it on the internet. I'm just fixing the camera.
You just have to delete 7 seconds.
What 7 seconds? Yeah. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Trip. And this is a Homebrewed Christianity podcast as well as a launch party. That means it is audiological, theological excitement for the masses. And so how many of you have ever listened to the podcast before? All right. So you understand what's about to happen. Everyone else asked one of them because we had very limited time. And I rarely get to talk Philip Clayton into answering questions that I haven't told him what I'm going to ask. And he's my dissertation advisor.
So be careful.
That's right. So I said, have we ever had a conversation under 45 minutes? And he said, no. And I said, what if in 15 minutes we exegeted 6 different ecclesiological texts from the New Testament, and giving people 6 different exegesis they could take in to preach warehouse ecclesiology in the churches? Phil was like, that sounds good. So that's what's about to happen. Now, if you have a clock.
Now we need somebody with an
I know.
iPhone. 2 minutes.
Yeah. We're going to see if you can do it quickly.
Can you do it, Maria? Can you time?
All
2
right.
minutes. We only get 2 minutes per.
After I tell him what text he's exegeting.
But yeah.
And then we'll all grade him together.
How about if I only get 1 minute and you get, then we can discuss for a minute.
All right. All right, text number 1, warehouse ecclesiology. First part of this wonderful sermon series inspired by the Twin Sock Launch Party podcast. Your text is Luke 10. This is the sending of the 70, not the 12, the second sending in Luke, where they're sent out empowered to do the very activities the Spirit empowered Jesus to do in Luke 4.
Luke, the pattern here is calling by the power of the Spirit to move out into places unknown. He moves beyond the 12 now to the 70, not negating the ones who come before, but asking now that a larger number go out. They need to go out with no possessions. It's no purse, no bag, and no sandals, no Birkenstocks, right? Notice though it needs to be left behind in order to bring a new message. Then they go out, they live with people, they eat with people, they try to share the message. And friends, if there's no response, you wipe the dust off your sandals and you move on. Trip, what I think Albert.
Well, obviously a Taylor Swift song reference. Anyway, one of the things I find amazing about what the Spirit's up to in Luke is that it's verbs. How many churches do you show up and what they describe themselves doing? It tends to be ideas or it tends to be practices, but it's not verbs that you do outside that you're sent out to do. So if you were sitting there thinking to yourself, like, what are those verbs that make the rhizome tickle? Which one do you think?
There you go. And let me just add that we have also not big community and not solo, but small group. Got a small group dynamic going on here, groups of 2. Right? So think of what happens when the going, the sending, and the sharing of these groups 2 by 2.
And one of the things I love about it is the first word you're supposed to say is peace to this house.
Beautiful.
That's rarely the first word anyone hears when a religious person shows up. Peace to this, really?
No.
Where's the hook? And by that I mean eschatological conscious torment. All right, next text. Philippians 2. This is Paul taking that Trinity hymn that he heard and decided to use. Like, this is Lord, I lift your name on high. But then he's like, by the way, did you know it might actually be something you participate in? So what is going on when Paul takes these words we normally sing in church and goes, guess what? Let the same mind be in you. And that's the melody of the song.
So we always love to start with that verse 4. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. We leave out the first 3 verses. The first 3 verses are about the building up of community. And I think the context actually comes in Philippians 3:10, the sharing in his sufferings, koinonia, not being defined as kumbaya, but as the sharing in sufferings. So the phronesis, the Greek practical wisdom of Aristotle, gets turned into a verb in verse 4. Let this mind of practical mindset be among you, that you, and then the high moment of Christology, the one who is in the very form of God. And now here's the exhortation to the believing community, not to count equality with God something to be grasped, but ekinosin, the most beautiful verb in the New Testament, to empty oneself. But emptied himself, taking on the form of a servant, or doulos, slave, being born in the likeness of man, and being found in human form, a second humbling, all the way to where it hurts the most, even to death. Now the question is, who gets to claim verses 9 to 11? Therefore, his name is exalted, he's raised to the highest place, and everyone bows down, right? Is that the white steeple church? Do we all immediately get to claim that rise up again? Or is it only those who've been on the very, very bottom, who've known oppression to their very skin, who've been the victims of unjust systems, who've been the ones punished? Maybe what we need to practice out of this passage trip is not to grasp verses 9 to 11, but to spend a little bit more time in verses 5 to 8. And let's find those who are completely on the bottom of the heap. Let's find them and offer to them that promise of hope. The kenosis then is a kenosis of attitude. Oh, I didn't give you any time.
It was close.
I love that mess.
I never cut him off right in 2 minutes. But one of the things I thought about that verse, when we talk systematic, and Roger hates Skype in to talk about his ecclesiology, one of the students, and at Claremont, we have Korean students who know the Bible, and then everyone else doesn't. And they're always surprised if Bill reads the Bible. It really hurts his reputation on campus. But when you talk to Roger Hayden, like, this guy knows his Bible. So the students come around in front of the screen, right? Jesus, the symbol of God, greatest Christology, second half of the 20th century, the first one developed constructive postmodern Christology that is a spirit Christology that escalates up to the Christological affirmations of the church. And they bring this passage up and go, well, what about the affirmation at the end? And he goes, well, you do know from very early on, when every knee bows and every tongue confesses, the church wondered whether or not Satan was saved, not who got kicked out. And so some of the times, I think, for us, is as we regain the traditions, we find out that what were attack verses actually become inspirations to see the wideness in God's mercy rupturing through the text. Amen. And even the poor readings we've been given. Paraclete, John 14, and the real trick is we can do this in 2 minutes because he has a whole book he's working on around the Paraclete. But this is the gift of the advocate, that final prayer and blessing Jesus gives his disciples at the end of the Gospel of John. How are you going to warehouse that, John?
This is such a painful verse because I spent years with the religion and science people trying to dissect the action of God and find out how it could be that God could break into the natural order without breaking any laws of natural science. And one day, a young Korean woman was describing the treatment of comfort women in her country. And she said that in working with them as a pastor, that the verse of the Paraclete had been the most powerful understanding of the power of God. And I suddenly realized all we need to know is Parakletos, the one who comes alongside. Not the dissecting the methods and the causes, but the presence of the Spirit who comes alongside to empower. Comes alongside whom, by the way? Those who suffer the most. So the link between your John 14 passage and Philippians 2 is beautiful. Those who are at the bottom of the heap are those to whom the Spirit is most intimate, most present, and the arms of Spirit are most around them.
Yeah, and one of the questions I always have that comes up in this is John's strong dichotomy between like the people of God and the world. And it says that the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him. How do we hear that verse and then not take such a dualistic, antagonistic stance to the world? What's the world when it says the world?
That's actually a really challenging question. The only thing I can think is that we deepen ourselves more and more into the character of the one who chooses to be present by coming alongside those who hurt the most. And can the character of that one be satisfied with a dualism or dichotomy in the end, so that only some are invited and others are excluded? The answer has to be no.
There's Homebrewed is a theologian, you may have heard of him before, and he talks about reading those passages through the Logos at the beginning, that he came to his own and they knew him not. And so the rejection of the world to the truth in John is not a means to critique the world, but a call to blessing. And when you see that you, as the one with the paracleter, to come alongside those whom God intends to bless, but have not seen the blessing coming.
The Hebraizos, right? The community of those who recognize the Spirit has come alongside, and their roots interlink with others' roots, and the whole plant is caused to grow.
You are the salt of the earth, and you are the light of the world. What's up with that? You, plural.
That's a tasteless comment.
Sometimes you decide whether or not you're going to pick on it until after I finish it.
Go.
Yeah. So what is Jesus just gave the blessings in the Sermon on the Mount, and then you have these two communal "y'all are" statements. How does that impact the way we see ourselves?
That's not fair, though, to drop us with salt and light unless you do the Beatitudes first. Because after all, who are the us? Right? Who are we talking about? Aren't we talking about those who are the poor in spirit in Matthew, or just the poor in Luke? Who are the ones who've been persecuted, who are the ones who are the meek and the mild and the marginalized and the oppressed and the harmed? Right? And once you pick out that unlikely gang of stragglers, and you say, to you has come the Son of God. To you are the ones called into community. And then they say, okay, so what should we do? Well, you need to walk not 1 mile, but 2, to get both cloak and undergarment. You're the ones who need to manifest love, not just comfortably within your small circle, but to all. And then in that context, let's talk about salt and light.
In both salt and light are not primary objects, right? Like rarely, like salt is an accompanying thing to a dish. It adds a little flavor, but it's not the featured thing. The light illumines things, but it's not the thing. It's very rare, especially after Christendom arrived, that the church doesn't want to be the thing. In fact, if its logo is not on it, you can only get $500 in my church.
It's true. You jump from the dualisms of John to light in Matthew, but that's not fair. We need to read light here out of the Beatitudes. Light are those who, in the context of suffering, become vessels or channels for the Spirit of God. So there's no dualism to worry about in Matthew.
Well, what about in Acts 2 when the Holy Spirit shows up when we get Pentecost? Because, that's always dangerous at mainline Protestant churches. Like, one time I got an amen.
One time.
That's what you said. The sermon will be shorter today.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Yeah, so as I say, we need to learn from our Pentecostal and charismatic brethren, and from those who worship in cultures where you're allowed to talk, move, wave, shout, and stomp, right? Because maybe we're, amen, that's what I needed. Somebody said, shh. I saw that. Amen. So second, we have, if we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:49, be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. You really need an Acts 2 at that point. You need a spirit that's going to knock your socks off. Because what you just read in the Gospels, in the 4 Gospels that preceded, is pretty darn frightening. It's over the top. But I actually love, and finally, the Babel-like reference, right? The Tower of Babel is built, and God confuses their language, right, in Genesis. And now we have him speaking all the languages of the world, but now motivated by the one common Spirit of God, the Spirit whom Christ sent. That's an exciting way to think about Acts 2.
Yeah, and one of the things I like is the response of everyone. Like, rarely are you okay succeeding but not being counted as successful. And obviously the Holy Spirit effectively communicated stuff. And the response from some is, well, what does this mean? Others sneered, some said, I believe they drank too much wine. But I say that because think of how many conferences you've gone to as the person who's attempting to make religious, theological talk palatable to people who have not realized that kind of when Christians show up, we've already like swallowed the weird pill called the homeless dead Jew is the image of the invisible God. Like nothing that comes out of your mouth after that's not crazy. But for some reason, we're professional at trying to legitimate ourselves. And we don't want to sound weird. We don't want to be filled up with new wine. But then at church on Sunday, that homeless dead Jew is the revolutionary who is the anticipatory rupture of God's new banquet for us. Like, there's not a joint that big in LA.
No California jokes. Who's the neo-Nazi community in Philadelphia? Shane Claiborne said, isn't it strange to worship a homeless man on Sunday and to ignore him on Monday?
All right, Phil.
Less than 2 minutes.
Yeah, he's got like this like stack of one-liners. Like, if I say this and slowly move the mic away, I win.
Yeah.
All right. Now I'm
Until you finish the dissertation in the
Yeah, well, all right, Matthew 13, and this is a collection of some of those zinger of Kingdom of God parables or Kingdom of Heaven parables there, where we got the parable where the Kingdom of Heaven is like a mustard seed, the Kingdom of Heaven is like yeast, the Kingdom of Heaven is like these seeds, and then they grow, but it's right next to all the weeds, but you aren't going to knock it down and destroy it. How do these images that Jesus presents parabolically about the Kingdom of Heaven become ways of re-envisioning ourselves as the Christian community?
That's a fantastic choice. If we didn't coordinate that, but that fits perfectly with the talk we just did. First, the Kingdom of Heaven appears in a place where it's small and unnoticed, like the grain of the mustard seed, right? A warehouse seminary, right? A twin top in an unnoticeable place is exactly where the Kingdom of God should be growing. In the old days, we built glorious seminaries on the mountaintops, right? I mean, the people in inner city LA still joke about Claremont being out there in the burbs, and that says everything to them. This is not the suburbs. Okay? This is the place where life is real. If you've been homeless or on the streets, you know that that means life is real. That's number one. And number two, what I admire about this experiment is that it's not separating the wheat from the tares, not tearing out those weeds in advance. I quoted Nietzsche in explaining the upside-down ethic of the New Testament. Right? Where I came from, you say, no, Nietzsche's an atheist, so he's awful. You burn his books, and then you get back to the New Testament. Let's learn from all the plants that are growing around us, rhizomatically now, rather than doing the separation of sheep and goats. There is one who can separate sheep and goats, but he or she is not in this room, right? Or at least not sitting at the table eating dinner.
Yes. All right, well, thank you very much for participating in our exegetical experiment. If you would all give Phil a hand as we welcome Barbara right up here. So as we're getting started, I just need to tell her a secret. When I was 23 years old, I was given Race in the Cosmos, and I was thinking about like grad school vocation and all that kind of stuff. And it was one of those books where I was reading it and all the dots got connected. And then I set it down and kind of looked in the mirror, trying to decide if I was like still the person I was before I read it. So like it's like Dietrich Bonhoeffer did it in 7th grade. Then like junior year in undergrad, it was Paul Tillich, and then you came along. And I've never met either one of them, so this is quite exciting.
Are you the same as you were?
No, and so what I thought would be fun is to talk a little bit about your recent book, Dreaming, and about dreams in the religious tradition and scriptures, and then what is it like to be the one that does a little dreaming with a warehouse and money and ATS and all those crazy boundaries that you just ruptured right through, and taking the risk to do something like Twin Summit. But before that, I want to make sure everyone's listening in here decides to get a book about dreaming. So, when did you decide that dreams were something to attend to theologically, as a scholar and as an individual?
I didn't. I was born into it. I come from a long line of dream-keeping women, Gullah women from the South Carolina Highlands, on my father's side. And we have always believed that there were no limits to the perimeters of knowledge or sight. And so dreams were conduits. It's the way those who were in the life beyond life communicated with you. They spoke to you in dreams. They came back. They said they were fine. You had a clue, but they were doing fine. And then they would give you a sign in current times to let you know it's really them. So with my aunt being a dream-keeping woman and going through the traditions, I decided to translate mine into theology because I didn't want to be sleeping and dreaming and prognosticating all the time. But it still is part of my being. I think it's really arrogant to believe that what you see and what you can touch is the limit of all that there is. And so that if you can believe that you dream, and of course, Alfred Schutz says you dream alone, but then your task is to bring it out into the public and say, what have you dreamed? And what can we dream together in reality?
Oh my goodness. All right. That was like on my inside, my little theology nerd just went, I started beating faster. Here's one of the things I wonder, so if you're sitting there hanging out with nerds that always avoid the fact that dreams are used throughout scripture, and then should you tell them your own story, and they're like, she's a smart, intelligent woman, but she's talking about dreams, and this seems really weird. What is the weird thing that our imaginations refuse to, take something seriously that scripture does and people you know do, and even yourself, right? If they had a few more drinks and there were no mics, how many people in here would have had dreams that mean something to them and actually inspired them to make decisions? But for some reason, as leaders in spiritual communities, you're like, whoa, I don't know what to talk about. Where do you think the source is to the protest of just being open to this kind of phenomena, experience, and that kind of thing?
Well, the churches always talk about the Spirit. And the Spirit leads in all truth, but can't get in during the daytime because the television is on, and your mind is on other things, and you're doing your homework, and you're driving your car. So when does the Spirit really get a chance to lead and guide, except when you give up and go to sleep? And so it's through dreams that you get led, but the church is afraid of it. We sing about the Spirit, we beg the Spirit to come, but if the Spirit came, it would frighten us. And so when you do these kinds of things, you have to be open. You have to say, what comes next? I don't know what it is, but I'm willing to follow a path where I can't see beyond the lamp under my feet.
Oh yeah. One of the things I really like about the way you discuss dreams is there's a sense in which dreams are the past attending to your present to not miss what's there. And then dreams are also the future given to you, don't close the possibilities off. So as ministers and leaders, what are some of the ways you kind of imagine us inheriting our past and attending to it with the attentiveness where we're open to dreams, but also letting that dreaming process open up possibilities as opposed to close off possibilities?
Forgetting that it's not linear. It's not from one point to another. It's Hans George Gadamer. It's reflexive. You go back to the past, you get what you need, you leap into the future. It's something that keeps pushing you and propelling you forward. You're deeply rooted in what you come from, but you're growing toward what you don't know.
So what made this venture seem dreamable? I've hung out with a lot of seminary executives, and we did a big grant at Claremont. 40 seminary deans and presidents came, and I did not identify a dream in the room. And then then here's you, and you're like, that's right, that's what we're gonna do. You're sitting here smiling, excited, and pumped. So when was it that the dream visited you, and you said, I'm gonna do the risk, I'm gonna take the chance, I'm gonna go out on a limb and try this new thing?
Oh, I guess when I stopped being a lawyer and I decided to get out of the front seat of the car and get into the back and follow the leading the Spirit in my own life. I had no plans to come to Minnesota. It's too cold. I was living in Memphis, Tennessee, minding my business when the leading began. And so if you're open, doors begin to open, and you begin to relax about what could happen, what could go wrong. If Torsten walks up to Sharon and I, the Board of Trustees, and said, let's dream. Let's dream about what would happen if theology intersects with everyday life. I don't look like your ordinary president. I don't act like your ordinary president of a school in Minnesota. So why not follow the leading of the Spirit?
So when we get back together in 5 years and throw a celebratory banquet, like what is it that you're looking forward to clapping for? Many of us have not even started to think or dream about.
Incongruity, poetry, jazz, strangeness, weirdness. I want to see theology just popping up where it doesn't belong. I want to see the engagement of culture and society. I want the community back in theological education and theological education back in the community.
Well, I hope we're all going to be back in 5 years to do just that. So after, especially those streaming right now, you go to Amazon and purchase the book Dreaming so that you too can have your theological imagination unleashed and have courage to open new doors. Would you all join me and thank you, Martha, for coming up here and talking, and welcome and some of the theologians from and where's Paul? Paul, come here. Or Paul? Oh, Paul Kappens, come here. So y'all don't know this, but Paul Kappens, I've been doing the Homebrewed podcast since 2008, and each month we have 50, 60,000 different IP addresses, which means humans, download a podcast. And the single most downloaded episode is Paul and I smoking cigars and talking about existentialism and Paul Tillich in my garage. Like, Nancy Rice didn't win, Bill Clinton didn't win, though I wish he had just heard, Bell didn't win. Like, it was a nice existentialism encounter in the garage. So it's always good to have Homebrewed heroes back on. And Torsten, here's a question. I know Paul. Paul is like the inheritor of everything that makes a theology nerd excited about the liberal education tradition. And then I met you, and I'm still trying to figure out what's going on. But then y'all two are hanging out, which makes it real interesting to me. Because, like, I love Paul, and then you are really getting me excited and stuff about what's he talking about. But then you're right there, I'm going to try to figure it out by hopefully making a few connections. And I want to start by talking about hermeneutics. Now, Paul, that's right. In very few places you did a class for hermeneutics. Praise Frederick Schleiermacher. Anyway, one of the things that is an avenue that refocuses theological education at Twin Summit is hermeneutics. Now, hermeneutics was invented as something we spent tons of time attending to as theologians a while ago. And you're a historical theologian. We've had discussions about it. So could you tell me about the birth of hermeneutics in the liberal theological tradition? And feel free to, name drop a little David Tracy out here. It's all good. I know you hung out with him.
Well, it's great to be with you, Trip. I'm glad to be on your podcast again. I'm glad to be with all of you tonight. Glad you're here. Hermeneutics as a discipline really began with the founder of liberal Protestant theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher. He was the first to give sustained attention to this inquiry in its distinctively modern sense of the word. And then the tradition of reflection upon hermeneutics, what actually we mean when we talk about interpretation, was further developed by people such as Wilhelm Dilthey and Rudolf Bultmann and Hans-Georg Gärtner. And then in this country. It's been further developed by, among others, my teacher David Tracy at the University of Chicago, who's a Roman Catholic theologian. And so it has a distinguished pedigree of about 2 centuries now. And I think we're going to continue that distinguished pedigree, carrying forward. So to new questions and new vistas.
So hermeneutics kind of comes from this moment where the theological reflection of the church all of a sudden sees these documents and these texts and their traditions as things that have a life apart from the surface, right? They have a history, they have voices that were part of the process, they have ones that were edited out, they were redacted, that the process of interpretation itself of the text has a history along with the process of getting to the text. And one of the things I remember when we had our independent study when you were at Claremont was how carefully you attended to all the voices that were a part of a text coming together, be it Augustine or the Gospel of John, and all those that have been wrestling with it since then. As a teacher, how does this notion of attending to interpretation give text life rather than just attending to what's already there on the surface?
Well, I think that if you want to talk about the birth of hermeneutics, you're talking about a question that emerges at the same time as the birth of what we call historical consciousness in the modern West. When we begin to have a sense that the Bible, the major text of Christian theology, was written in a time and place that's very different from our own as modern or contemporary interpreters, and that gap has to be overcome in some way if we're going to be able to reappropriate a text from another time and place and make it relevant to our time and place. So I've always thought that the hermeneutical tradition, beginning with Schleiermacher and going forward to these other figures, has helped us to become self-conscious and self-critical in the ways that we interpret and appropriate the Bible, as well as the post-biblical tradition for us today. It helps us to remember that we too are located in a particular time and place in history, that we are not standing outside of history studying people who are in history, but we too have historicity, to use a term coined by existentialists, and that we have to take all of that into account when we're thinking about what it means to interpret a text in an intellectually and morally responsible way. What does it mean that we are interpreters of texts who make decisions about what it means to understand the text? What hermeneutical consciousness is about is the recognition that all understandings of the text are interpretations of the text, and that therefore who we are as the interpreters has to be factored into reflection on what it means to interpret.
Yeah. And one of the conversations that Torsten and I had when he was in Redondo was how his kind of image of hermeneutics is not just attending right to the power dynamic when you as an authority person are interpreting, and not just attend to the historicity of yourself and your community or the community it comes from, but expanding it, recognizing that kind of the missional intention of a minister requires them to attend to more than their own historicity when interpreting. That our communities and the places we live and serve and interpret from have other narratives, other stories, other problems, other issues that they're dealing with. And so maybe Torsten, you can say something about this, because I remember you used the phrase, and I spent about 5 or 10 minutes trying to get you to explain what you meant by the word, and then I realized that you're just crazier than I expected. Right, like that you actually meant that a hermeneutics class was not just going to be all the books I wanted to read with Paul, but other books. And that all the humanities and all these things get brought in. So how have you are seeing the conversation around interpretation hermeneutics expanding and being transformed in a venture like this?
Well, for me, in my own journey, it was there were a number of points where it became important to me to actually interpret and to actually figure out what interpretation means. Because part of the legacy of what Paul was just talking about, and I second everything he said about it, part of the legacy of that, and this is maybe the darker side of it, was that there's a lot of unspoken hermeneutical, there are a lot of unspoken hermeneutical maneuvers that actually prevent you from interpreting. And that's a problem. When I did my PhD in England, I was deeply dissatisfied with my own work. I am to this day. I can't go back and read it. I think it satisfied the criteria of the academy just fine. I was commended on it, and I published it with a good publisher and all the rest of it. But I knew something was deeply wrong about it. And I decided, let's just finish this thing and move on. And that's what I did. But I didn't know which way to move on until some of us started asking the question, what is actually interpretation? Some of the legacy of these last 200 years that Paul talked about, and this is the negative side, there are a lot of positive sides to it too. But one of the negative sides to it is that quite often it asks you to attend to all sorts of other things other than the thing you're supposed to be interpreting. Right, so you mentioned earlier redactions and things like that. So texts have different, we think they went through different processes, at least some of them, by the time they, you end up with a final version. And so scholars are fascinated with that, and they start looking at that, and they speculate about, who wrote what, when, and what did they have for breakfast. Well, even if we knew what they had for breakfast, so what? Even if we knew there were 5 layers prior to it, so what? If we want to interpret 5 layers back, let's try and figure them out and interpret that. But nobody actually does that. People try and figure out layers behind texts, and then they don't know what to do with it theologically. And that's the first time when I started to realize, along with others, of course, we don't do this in isolation, as Paul rightly said. You start to realize that you have to decide, are you just going to pursue historical questions for the sake of it, or do you need a criterion for determining which historical questions actually help interpret the thing you're supposed to interpret? And for me, that's hermeneutics, and that's where imagination comes in. You need a criterion for what kind of imagination is feasible and what is just plain crazy, like you accused me of. That kind of thing, that's where hermeneutics comes in.
One of the things that what you said just made me think of is, I like to bring up John Cobb on a consistent basis because I'm in charge of his fan club. And we were having a conversation about growing, you go through the seminary process, Bill talked about it, it's like a professor's spiritual gift is killing the spirit and every possible thing that could have inspired you to go to seminary, and then you become an atheist or a barista with graduate school day. And John was real frustrated that the early liberal theological tradition was not that at all. It's like packed full of piety. You couldn't not find piety in Schleiermacher. He sounds more like progressive evangelicals than does liberals today, right? So he was talking about it, and he goes, I just wish that theological education taught the interpreters that every text, there's a whole wardrobe of interpretations, and figuring out what they were previously or what they were, that's fine. But the key is at the end you dance. Like you are dancing with the text and inviting everyone else into the dance. And it's the dance, the performance, the excitement that generates it, that it's there. It serves a purpose of engagement. And I wonder how that balance works out, right? Like where you're a steward to the tradition, the knowledge, and all that kind of thing, and you're a steward to what's the other thing? Is it the community? Is it your mission? Is it what's that thing that you're attending to with the gifts of critical thinking tradition and such?
So on the assumption that to become a better interpreter is a good thing because it helps you respect the other rather than turning it into your own image, on that assumption, which is very much my assumption, your question makes a lot of sense. What is it that guides that? Is it just the community? Community is super important, obviously. But we know plenty of communities that go awry in horrible ways, and clearly you can't say the communities save themselves from anything. So there's got to be something else. And this is where I think historicism that tends to I think of it almost like, the text is like a trampoline, and you put it in a slanted kind of way, you jump on it, and automatically you get launched off sideways and you're gone, and the text is, the trampoline is sort of sitting there. Instead of bouncing up and down on it, and actually interpreting it, if you will, you just jump on it to get launched somewhere else. And that can't be it. So what is the thing that actually keeps you on it? that keeps you learning stuff on the trampoline. I think of my son here, does amazing stuff on the trampoline, and I break my neck. But what is it? And I would say that there's this thing called narrative epistemology, narrative theology, whatever you want to call it, that's absolutely crucial. So to give you an example, students are often worried about, if you look at the canon, the Old Testament books, the 39, and the New Testament ones, the 27, except in other traditions and maybe more, like Roman Catholic tradition and so on. If you look at those, then people often ask, what is it that made those 66 be exclusively 66? Well, as an interpreter, I don't worry about that. I don't. I mean, it's an interesting historical question. It's particularly interesting if you want to know what happened 350 years after the New Testament. But as an interpreter of the New Testament, for instance, I'm far more interested in taking each document seriously. So what is it about each document that gives it an inherent sort of consistency, that gives you a criterion for interpretation, whether it makes sense or not, whether the dance you pick actually matches the music you're dancing to, because it better. So what is that? And I think it's the narrative implications of the text. So if you know a text is monotheistic rather than polytheistic, if you know a text is creation affirming rather than escapist, if you know a text is about eschatology in the sense of God establishing justice in a broken world, if you know those things and it's consistently there, that gives you a wonderful criterion for interpretation. And I think we need to be in the business of becoming better interpreters, including our communities need to become better interpretive communities. So the narrative piece, I think, is crucial.
So as professors, when you're in a class with someone, what questions do you want to disturb twin-slot students long enough they have to stay up at night and wrestle? Like when you as professors succeed, what's the question that they had the extra coffee just because they had to have a conversation with another student, because otherwise, the whole universe is not in balance. That's kind of the scenario.
Well, I mean, I would say it's a couple of things that are connected. One is, if I had my way, I would say to students, if you are purporting to interpret the text or whatever it is, you're interpreting culture too. It doesn't have to be a text, or it could be text in that sense of culture. Whatever you're interpreting, do it. Interpret it. Don't just use it as an excuse to do some other thing. Also, be aware of who you are, and this is what Paul was talking about earlier in terms of hermeneutics, Heidegger, Gadamer, and so on. Be aware of your own presuppositions. Without presuppositions, there's no interpretation. It was a hard lesson for me to learn, but it's an important one. So how do you make the link then from interpreter to text? And this is where I think, for instance, evangelicals as well as liberals have often been equally struggling in terms of acknowledging imagination in interpretation. Without imagination, there's no interpretation. Kind of think, you think Boston Tea Party and what is it? No taxation without representation. I think no interpretation without imagination. That's the crucial piece. And so, what then is an informed imagination? If a student can ask that question and gradually make progress in answering that to me is absolutely crucial.
All right, Paul, what question when you find out someone spent a little too much time up at night disturbed by?
Well, there's so many questions that I want people to think about that I can't single out a single one. But what I would say is not that there's a critical question I want students to stay up late at night pondering, but I think there's a value that I want to instill in students that goes against the grain of American culture, especially American religious culture, and that is I want students to think deeply, critically, and self-critically about the existential issues involved in religion, which requires that one become a good interpreter of religion and human existence. And the value I want to instill is that kind of critical reflection is not antithetical to the life of faith or spirituality, which is the basic fear permeating American culture, that we think deeply and critically about what our ultimate concerns are. We're not going to have any faith in God left. And that's been the major hurdle that I've dealt with whether I'm dealing with students on the right or students on the left. And that's what's astonishing, is just how pervasive the anti-intellectualism is when it comes to religion. So I agree with Kava. I've never found that kind of, in the liberal Protestant tradition in which I identify, I've never found that this kind of critical reflection leads to atheism or is inherently atheistic or anti-faith or some such thing. But that's a very difficult lesson for a lot of people to learn because of the fear that's so deeply instilled in them.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that, this is the last question you both answer. One of the things that I found was always energizing throughout education is when your questions that plague you as a student are the questions your professors don't know how to answer yet. Right, like, so that you're actually invited into a conversation with a human being rather than this talking, speaking book. And so what kind of questions do you think are excellent ones that you hope students show up with, and when they ask you, you go, I don't know, but you can still come here, and I hope you don't leave. But this is a great question because I don't know the answer to it.
This is easy, Trip.
That's what I
It's the epistemological question about God, to my mind, meaning how we talk about God. If students have questions about how we talk about God, then as a professor, I immediately reach a limit, and I'm happy to say so right away. You know, there's a ceiling in terms of what we're capable of, in terms of understanding transcendence. Basically, we can only pretend to be understanding transcendence because we're not transcendent. That's the whole idea of transcendence. So if a student asks that question and comes to the conclusion maybe that it's hard to pretend that you understand the transcendent as if it were immanent. In other words, like you, that is absolutely crucial because it leads to something that I think we're lacking in. It leads to what I sometimes call epistemological humility. In other words, we recognize our limits and we're cool with it. And I have no problem. If somebody wants the best arguments for, I don't know, a physical resurrection of Jesus or something like that, you know, part of me wants to say good luck, and part of me wants to say there are limitations and we can only talk about the transcendent as if we were there while recognizing that we're not. And the reason this is so important to me is not just for personal sanity, but also
which is a positive thing.
but also because I think one of the root causes of fundamentalisms, whether they're conservative or liberal, doesn't matter because they're equally lacking in bandwidth. One of the crucial causes for that is a lack of epistemological humility.
Mm-hmm.
I have all sorts of questions that students ask me that I can't answer. It's questions of a factual nature simply because nobody can know everything. But I don't know that there are any questions that students have asked or could ask that I'm not willing to converse with them seriously about. I mean, if they're asking me to answer their questions for them about God, who God is, or you know, ex cathedra sort of fashion, of course I can't do that precisely because I have that well-deserved epistemological humility. What theology, study of theology has taught me is just what the limits of my own knowledge are. So I'm not sure exactly what your question is in terms of.
What's a question you don't know the answer to, and that makes it an interesting one to ask?
Well,
like, you know, like, if someone's like, is Kobe Bryant the greatest basketball player? Then, yes, obviously. So, but is the triangle still viable now that we've rearranged the defense rules in the NBA? That's a good one, I don't know.
I just have to think about your question longer. I can't.
Here's one of the things I actually thought of from a previous conversation we had. We walked out of a class on Kant's third critique together. We start discussing it, and it's aesthetic judgment, whatever. Phil taught. And then we started having a conversation around beauty and tragedy. And I don't remember what sparked it, but I think Austin was with us, and he said something, and your response was one of those beautiful ones that teachers had. You said, well, you know, I don't know how to hear that without thinking of, and you told the story from your past and loss early on in your life of a friend. And then you said, so when I ask that question, that's where I ask it from. And here's, as a Christian, here's the hope I have for it, but I also have doubts about it, and they're kind of both there. And that's what I wrestle with. And I thought, wow, that's the kind of thing that's enticing and exciting to me when I think about theological education of the future. Someone where the professor's not like, let me lead you into certainty, but let me sit here with you as a simultaneously skeptic and believer that's inside both of us simultaneously.
Well, I've never understood my role as a teacher to lead anybody into certainty. I mean, that's just never been, I mean, I just don't see that as the proper role of a teacher at all. So I'm not teaching myself or my own theology when I teach. I'm teaching people how to think theologically, how to formulate their own questions in a more complex and sophisticated manner, and to give them all the resources available to them to help them think through whatever issues are important to them.
Mm-hmm. All right. So what I would like to do is for Torsten to introduce Maria, and everyone welcome her, and thank Paul for hanging out with us.
Well, to some extent, I already did it earlier, but just to say in terms of journey, we used to work, both of us used to work for a different institution here in town, somewhat different school, the School of Theology or Seminary, and it so happened that we both moved on from there in sort of different directions, and then recently when the opportunity came along to start Twinsot, we sort of reconnected and we're partnering again. So all of that is just in addition to what I said earlier, is that Maria is our missions director, does a wonderful job with that, and does a wonderful job organizing this kind of thing, and generally bringing sanity and charm to what we're doing. So.
All right, Maria, I have a couple questions for you. But we have to look at the people that are streaming because we're peer pressuring them to turn in their application.
Hello, people.
So what types of students are Twinsot looking for? Like local, full-time, second career, lifelong learning, distance education? I don't know, tell me about it.
Well, the easy answer, and the one I'd like to give, is all of the above plus. So going back to a little bit what I said earlier, in this kind of seminary culture in the country, and especially in the Twin Cities, because we know we're not the only seminary around, why are we starting another one? Furthermore, an even more intricate question, why is a seminary starting another seminary, right? What's the deal with that? There are so many people in this generation, and I'm one of them, so I'm talking to myself and probably a lot of you out there. We call them the post-evangelicals, or as we affectionately like to call them, the posties. Post anything, okay? Post-evangelical, post-charismatic, post, fill in the blank. And the issue is, these posties, they're a lot too progressive for the typical seminary that's out there that would normally be their seminary of choice, but they're still a little too right for other places that would deem themselves as liberal. And so what we're hoping to do at Twin Cities School of Theology is to offer this postie generation a place where they can come and ask their questions past the categories, where they don't have to check a box, where they don't have to say, I'm liberal, or I'm conservative, or I'm moderate, or I'm this, or I'm that, but they can actually come to the table and say, you know what, I was this, but now I'm not sure what I am anymore, but we're gonna figure it out together. And that's one kind of student we're looking for. The second kind of students, since we're planted right here in the heart of downtown in the city, is the professional, the lawyer, the medical professional, the business person downtown who needs those continuing education credits to continue on in their profession and in their career, and they want to understand how to integrate theology, how to integrate faith into their job. They need to know they don't have to separate their head from their heart, and we want to be that for them.
So where do you imagine these posties posting it? Like where do you imagine them serving? I just thought of that. I really I'm like two people appreciate the posties where they post it. Trademark.
So where do we see these postings kind of going out into the world? Yeah, that's a great question. I think they're faltering right now. Okay, that goes back to sort of the authorship of Twinsot. They don't find themselves very comfortable in mainline denominations because it's not what they're used to, it's not how they've grown, it's not their tradition. But again, they're too progressive and they're asking questions that fundamental conservative evangelicals are just not. And so it can look anything like a new church plant, some student like hatchery might be, to starting nonprofit organizations that are based in social change and social justice, or to just getting a better handle on kind of what you think about God as opposed to what you feel, what you've grown up with, or superstition, something like that.
So when you think of this school, like what are the unique parts about its community? Like what are you hoping the vibe and things that you like tell your friends and family about the unique stuff of when you hang out with your peers? Like what kind of community vibe is the Twin Sod experience?
Oh my gosh, there's so much that I can say
Like
about
other than
that.
they get to hang out with you.
Yeah, well, the key thing is community vibe, okay? So we're not out in a suburb, this white campus that's isolated from any diversity, anything that's happening in the world, anything that's going on. Practical pieces to the community vibe, okay? So you're here in a classroom, you're going to Corner Coffee across the way, you're getting dinner, you're getting your coffee, maybe there's a food truck outside, maybe it's a beautiful night, and Torsten or Kyle, who's another professor who teaches here, they bring their students, outside, or, for a brew across the way, Fulton's right down the block. So something super practical as that, to more of an ethos, sort of metaphysical connection. Again, a lot of that has to do with being planted right in the heart of the city. So.
So I had an idea, and I've already told you that you're going to say yes to it. We're going to have a toast. So if everyone can make sure they have something in their glass, we're going to do a toast for the Warehouse of Dreams as a theological institution, anticipating the 5-year return in 5 years where we have a little party. So everyone stand up and make sure you have stuff in your glass.
I need a drink, Chris. Where's that vodka tonic with extra lime?
And it's because as you think through your wonderful toast that is going to inspire everyone, fill out their application for the Twin Sod Theological Education Experience.
Yes.
Thinking back to the destruction of the ecclesiastical industrial complex that Bill talked about, Diddy, or dreaming on with Barbara, and then talking about hermeneutics and what does it look like to expand it with Orson and Paul. And then we're talking about this experience. We're like, I gotta do a toast. It's gonna be exciting. If you got that, you should say it.
Let's see.
I can keep talking until you're ready.
Well, let's say this, to doing it together, to subverting theological education as we know it, not for the sake of being, the rebel or the maverick, but for the sake of real change, for the sake of true transformation, for the sake of being remnant and going forward into the future, not watching something die, but rebirthing it and giving it new life. Walking forward with an epistemological humility that says, you know what, we don't know everything, but we know something. We're going to put some things together and start something new. So, to the future.
Thank you. And thank you all for hanging out and such tonight.
And to those who will stay later and help us tear down and clean up, to you, please, thank you. Thank you so much, guys. Really, thank you.